my name is Brian Fowler. I will be presenting on the Wingate Sandstone in Indian Creek, Utah. A lot of what makes a presentation really interesting for me when we're in seminar is when the presenter has cool pictures of them in the field in action collecting data, or if they have a cool story about how they came to the interpretation of that data. A lot of doc stories are what really can keep us interested and show us how he has a lot of experience in that field. I don't necessarily have a lot of experience in the career of geology yet, but what I do have a lot of experience in is rock climbing. It's brought me to a lot of different outcrops and a lot of different types of rocks, a lot of granite and limestone that I've climbed, but something that led me to want to talk about the Wingate Sandstone is that a lot of the different sandstones that I've climbed on are incredibly diverse. Sandstones have tons of different sizes, textures, colors, strengths. Some are very hard and very resistant, some just crumble and fall apart in your hand. And briefly, I want to kind of show you a couple different locations and examples of all the different sandstones and how they're also different. This is kind of shot in between the legs. This is in Red Rocks, Las Vegas, Nevada. Huge sandstone deposits here. This is in South Africa, in Rocklands. These are all pictures that either I took or friends of mine took. This is in Arkansas, in the northwestern corner. Kolob Canyon. This picture doesn't have a climber for scale, but those trees are about 45 feet tall, so it's a pretty large outcrop. And lastly, this is a huge slab in Indian Creek, Utah. I wanted to point out these large fractures, and today I want to talk about how this particular sandstone is set apart from other sandstones and what are some of the characteristics that make it that way. So an overview, I would like to briefly go over the building blocks of sandstone, which should be a review for all of us, and show how those building blocks give different characteristics to the sandstones. And in particular, as I go through, I want to be relating it to the Wingate Sandstone, which is found in Indian Creek, Utah. And at the end, I want to talk about how these characteristics and knowing them and the predictive powers can be useful, and if what I talked about today is relevant to us as geologists. So coming back to this picture that I had at the very beginning, I really like it. It shows how the Wingate Sandstone in Indian Creek, Utah is a very prominent feature. So that cliff space there is the Wingate Sandstone. It's capped by the Kayenta Formation and underlied by the Chinle Formation. It's late Triassic and early Jurassic in age. So sandstone is made up of three main factors: the grains, the matrix, and the cements. And so quickly I'll review. The grains need to be from 0.1 millimeters to 2 millimeters. And they need to be of the minerals need to be of silicic rich minerals, so either coming from a quartz or feldspar. There's also lots of other rock fragments. They're rounded and well sorted, which means that they're normally coming from high energy environments. The matrix, which is all the other small particles included, besides the sand-sized particles, are what can contribute a lot to the color of the sandstone. So iron minerals found within the matrix, most commonly like hematite, oxidizes red. So that's what gives the sandstones a red pigment, especially in Indian Creek. There's a lot of red sandstone, and in other places in southern Utah. Also, there are other minerals that don't oxidize as red, but can also oxidize as brown and yellows, which is also something that's found in the Wingate Sandstone, a lot of brown and yellows as well. And the cement is the glue that holds it all together. So the cementing agents, which a lot of you guys also talked about, the diagenesis of rocks. It's kind of what holds it all together, and the most common ones are quartz and calcite, but there's also anhydrite, dolomite, gypsum, feldspar, and there are about 40 other known minerals that can be cementing agents. So porosity and permeability is also something really important for geologists, especially when we're talking about sandstones. When it's really well sorted, which the Wingate sandstone is because it's an Aeolian deposited sand dune, it's very porous, can hold lots of fluid. So sandstones that are great for rock climbing, that are really strong and very resistant, are very not porous. It dramatically decreases the porosity, which for a rock climber is also a good thing. So the more matrix and cement you have, which also solidifies and makes it very strong, makes it not very permeable, very less permeable, which I'm going to talk about why that's really important a little later. A little bit off topic of sandstones and its characteristics, but is relevant, is desert varnish. I wanted to mention it, one, because it protects the Wingate sandstone surface very well, and it also adds features. It's biophysiological activity. Microorganisms to live, they bring out the manganese and other mafic materials to the surface of the rock. It's not extremely well known how that process works, but when it is on the surface, it oxidizes and forms a coat that is really shiny and black and very hard and resistant. And these coats take thousands of years to form, which I feel is pretty interesting. It's very significant to a lot of the features in sandstones. So bringing it all together back with this picture and with the Indian Creek Wingate sandstone. It's capped by the Kayenta, as you can see up here at top. It's a slope former and it's fluvial deposited, which makes it not very well sorted and not very permeable, which acts as a perfect protection to the Wingate sandstone. If we remember, I mentioned that it was well cemented by calcite. And so if it didn't have this protection layer up here, it would be very weak and it would just erode away. Also, because it is Aeolian deposited, it is very well sorted, very well rounded grains, which makes it very strong under compressional strength. But the Wingate sandstone cliffs are very blocky with large vertical cracks that go throughout the whole entire formation. Underneath it, the Chinle Formation that underlies it is eroding away and undermines the strength of the Wingate sandstone. The other stresses that are put on the Wingate sandstone, because the layer underneath it is eroding away, are tensional stresses as it gets pulled apart, and shear stresses as it kind of slides back and forth, rather than just a compressional force. So these well-sorted grains in the Wingate sandstone aid in the vertical collapse of the Wingate sandstone. It's kind of hard to see for scale, there's not a climber up there, but that chunk of rock is, most places, 300 feet plus. So to have a vertical collapse all the way through the formation with these really long fractures, as you can see, is quite impressive. So the porosity, like I mentioned, weakens the rock. It's pretty significant for rock climbers and for other people, but it's significant because as it rains and the rock gets wet, the 75% of the dry strength of the rock is lost. And then the permeability, or the lack of permeability in the other layers, help protect it. And like I mentioned, desert varnish protects and adds features to the rock face there. You can see a lot of the darker areas here and here. That's just large sheets of desert varnish, the shiny black that is very strong and helps protect. So quickly, I do want to review, I think it's quite important to know that the predictive power that knowing these things about sandstone can give a lot of geologists. In the oil industry, it's obviously super relevant. For a planetary geologist who is looking to describe sandstone and uses an analog here on Earth. And maybe a consultant for a construction company who needs to know the strengths or the weaknesses of a sandstone that a subdivision could be built on. For a rock climber, it's also useful, but it's incredibly irrelevant, mainly because it's an industry with almost zero money compared to some of these other ones. But I think it's interesting to mention that it does keep a lot of climbers safe. We can't really climb when it's wet, things like that. Most people wouldn't know unless geologists would have made it known. And as I studied, I thought it was extremely interesting how the Wingate Sandstone in Indian Creek is there because of accumulation of a ton of different things that we've learned in sedimentology in this class all come together perfectly, with the chinley underneath it aiding in the vertical collapse, the protection on top from the Kayenta Formation. Because all of that is there, we can experience the Wingate how it is. If it wasn't all set perfectly, it wouldn't be there. So this is what I had to present for you today, and I appreciate all of you coming and listening, and I thank you very much for coming today.
Questions? I have a question. Where is Indian Creek?
It's about an hour south of Moab. I should mention that.
Hour south of Moab. It's great. It looks like a pretty place. All right. Other questions?
Yeah.
So you kind of mentioned the faults a little bit, but what's the main source, you could say, of the faults? Is it just that underlying?
So it's the really well sorted sand grains are what help initiate the vertical collapse. But it wouldn't happen unless there were shear stresses and tensional forces put on it, and that happens because the Chinley Formation kind of undermines that strength.
So are those faults running through like the entire formation, or just near like the outer face?
That's a good question. I'm not entirely sure. I know they go pretty deep. I know that from experience. You can lose gear. If you drop something, it'll just go forever. So I don't know if it goes all the way through the formation, because that's like kilometers thick in places, so I doubt it, but they are very, very deep.
And they tend to get accentuated at the surface because the Chinley, which Brian mentioned, is undercutting the rock. And basically the rock is trying to swallow off over time. And it's not over human time. But those fractures are opening up as the rock is eventually going to swallow off. But you can get fracture swarms that go through kilometers of rock. But this is a pretty pervasive area that Brian was showing. They're probably more related to the surface fall. I'm guessing. I don't know. Other questions?
Yeah.
You talked about the desert varnish. So is that on the rock face that you find the desert varnish?
Yeah, that's the only place you do find it, because those microorganisms that live on the surface, they bring the mafic minerals, especially manganese, to the surface, and that's where it oxidizes and creates the coats. Yeah.
So with the desert varnish, does it grow to a certain thickness and kind of quit because they can't reach back into the rock anymore?
It doesn't get very thick, and it's mainly because of weathering and erosion. So it does weather and erode, but it erodes and weathers much, much slower, and it's much more resistant than the surrounding sandstone. So it can't get incredibly thick, but it helps aid in the protection of the sandstone, but then creating features too.
So I know why Brian went into sedimentology. Or at least why he stayed awake half, which by the way, I laughed at when you started. I liked your intro, by the way, but you said, it's the stories that make, and this is the guy that goes to sleep more than anybody else.
Not during the stories, just during all the in-between stories.
Okay, comments for Brian.